You could say it's all about a specific kind of faith. It's all about enduring faith. Or you could say, well, there is no faith that is not enduring faith. That is the only faith that's worth talking about is faith that endures. Hebrews chapter 11 showed us what our endurance depends upon. And the summary of last week's study is worth remembering as we embark on a study of chapter 12. For we saw last week that how well your faith endures depends upon at least three things that come from chapter 11. It depends upon how connected you are to future and invisible things. It depends upon how distracted you are or aren't by present and visible things. And it depends upon how encouraged you are by other people of faith, both living and having lived in the past. And as we go on to what we call chapter 12, and as the writer goes on in working out his theme of encouragement to us who endure in faith, we see all of these points visited again or reviewed again in an analogy which we've already spent some time with this morning. For chapter 12, verse 1 talks about being surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And understand, these are witnesses or testimonies of the point that's being taught. These are examples of enduring faith. All those examples were mentioned in chapter 11. They surround us in the sense that we live our lives in the context of the sort of faith that they exemplified. And so as we looked last week at the whole idea of being encouraged by other people of faith, we should see all these heroes of the faith from Old Testament days as further encouragement to us. They're not alongside us to encourage us personally, but their lives are recorded in the Scriptures, and they encourage us by the lives they lived to get on with the life that we're called to live. And we see a call to lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us in chapter 12, verse 1. And that is again reminding us that we must be careful not to be distracted by the present and visible things of this world. For whether they are sin in themselves or not, they are encumbrances to a life that focuses upon the eternal. So we're told to lay aside the encumbrances and lay aside the sin which so easily entangles us so that we'll not be distracted or held back in our progress by present and visible things. And then we're told that we must fix our eyes upon Jesus. That's verse 2. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. And that's another way of saying what we've already seen, that the endurance of our faith depends upon how connected we are to future and invisible things. For Jesus is the main invisible thing, the invisible Lord that we serve. And the more clearly we focus our attention upon him, the less distracted we'll be by anything less beautiful, anything less noticeable. The more tightly we'll be connected to future and invisible things in general, and the more excellently we will perform our duties and get on with the life that God has called us to live. So chapter 12, verse 1, introducing an analogy or a comparison of the Christian's life to a life or to the experience of an endurance runner, reviews for us the lessons that we saw in chapter 11. I wanted you to notice that by way of reminder and also by way of preparing for an understanding of what else we see in chapter 12 our faith depends upon. We can see three more things in chapter 12, verses 1 to 13, upon which the endurance of our faith depends. And I hope that your mind is in the right frame and that you are properly concerned about the endurance of your faith and realize that whatever happens to you in the future, the really important issue is what the future does to your faith. For you must endure in your faith. It's the most critical part of your life. So we see in this comparison of the Christian's life to a runner's race three other truths about the endurance of our faith. And the first one, you can jot it down for yourself if you want to take notes, is that how well your faith endures depends upon who you look to as your role model. Who you look to as your role model would be the way to fill out the first statement, which comes from verses 2 to 4, where we're told to fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. Who you look to as your role model will determine how well your faith endures. Now, a runner realizes that from the starting line to the end of his experience, he is going to have to go through something like agony. In fact, the word translated race means agony. The whole idea of comparing the Christian life to a race tells you that it's not altogether enjoyable. And the runner has a strategy by which he can endure the agony or the stress of running, and the strategy is to focus on the finish line. Every runner realizes as the race is about to start that he must focus his eyes on the finish line. Now, for a sprinter, a 100-meter man or a 50-meter runner, that's simply a matter of getting his head up and looking down the path to the ribbon or the tape that stretches across the finish line. And he must imagine that he is the first one across that race, that finish line, and he does so by focusing his attention upon it. With his eyes, he looks at the tape. But of course, for a long-distance runner, and that's the sort of runner that a Christian is compared to, a runner who runs with endurance, he cannot see the finish, for it's a long way away. So he must focus upon it in his mind. He must see it with his mind's eye. He must see it in his imagination. And while he is persevering in the race, while he is pressing on in his life, he continues to think about the finish line. Now, this is what we're being told when we're told to fix our eyes on Jesus or look to Jesus, because we cannot see him except in our imagination, but we must see him if we are to endure in all of the demands of the Christian life. Because for every one of us living as Christians, the finish line experience is the experience of seeing Jesus face to face. Whether we die and go to be with the Lord, for to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, or whether we are living when the Lord returns to judge the earth, we will see him face to face, and at that point the race is over. The experience of finishing the race, the experience of finishing life for a Christian, is the experience of seeing Jesus face to face. You know this. The Apostle John says we don't know what we shall be, but we know that when we see him, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And he's talking there about our dying experience, or the experience of seeing the Lord's return. We will see the Lord face to face one day. And you can easily imagine, if it's not your experience, you can still imagine how continually thinking about seeing Jesus face to face will change the way you live. Just as keeping your mind on the finish line changes the way you run the race. Especially in a long-distance race. You're prone in your exhaustion to be distracted by many thoughts and to be caught up so much with the present difficulties that you lose sight of why you're in this race at all. But if you can think of the finish line, you can think of some things that encourage you to keep on running. And nothing will encourage you to persevere in your trust and obedience, to endure in your faith, as thinking ahead to the time when Jesus' eyes will meet your eyes, when you'll look full into his face. For what will we think when we see him? We'll think many things. But one thing we're sure to think is of how important it was to run a race well. And if on the last day, looking back on our lives, we are not particularly impressed with how well we ran the race of faith, then when we look at his face, we'll be thinking, I only wish I took the thing more seriously when I was back there in the middle of the course. Well, we can avoid that uncomfortable experience, or we can decrease the discomfort of it at least by continually focusing our attention upon the fact that the life we're living does have a conclusion, and the conclusion is standing before Jesus, who has been watching us run the race all along. For he's not like us, of course. He's different than we are. Although he's fully human, he's also fully God. And as God, he sees us every step of the way. We do not see him. We must imagine him, but he sees us. And he may well wish to make reference to May 1993 when we stand before him, whenever we stand before him. For he sees the race in all of its progress. He sees how we're running right now. If all the way through May 1993, we can keep in mind the fact that he is standing at the finish line waiting for us to finish the race, it will encourage us to run the race well during 1993, this month, and every other month. We must focus our attention upon where we're going. We must think about the end, all during the progress towards the end. That will steer us and direct us and motivate us to do well in these days. Besides the fact that he is at the finish line, that he is the one welcoming us across the line, there's another sense in which we must look unto him, which has to do with the analogy between being a follower of Christ in this life and being a long-distance runner. Not only is he the one at the finish line cheering us across, but he's also, in his own experience, the one and only one who has run a perfect race. His life was a life of faith as well. His life was an experience of trusting God enough to obey him. And no one demonstrated or exemplified faith perfectly except for him. If we look to other people as our role model, is if we look to other people for an example, sooner or later we'll find excuses to take it easy. We'll say, well, there's a very fine Christian, and he was a little bit of a goof in regard to that part of his life, so I guess that excuses a little bit of slackness in my life too. And whoever you look to other than Jesus, you'll always find some sort of human weakness which may well, in our weakness, justify a slackness of attitude. But if we're primarily looking to Jesus and understand that he is the role model, as the perfect runner, he is the one that we are to run like, then in every area of life we'll be spurred on to take seriously our responsibilities and to get on with the race. He is the perfect example of a runner. He's a perfect example of a person of faith. And for insight into how to trust and obey God in regard to any one of life's responsibilities, we get an excellent example when we look to him, and a less than excellent example when we look anywhere else. There's yet another reason, there's lots I suppose, but another reason I'd make mention of why we ought to be focusing on Jesus as we take each step of this race. You know, we do have a difficulty, born loving ourselves the way we do, in getting over ourselves enough to concentrate on loving God, on loving anyone else. And if we focus our attention upon some other human being as our role model, we will find a human being who, under close scrutiny, turns out to be not all that very fascinating anyway. There's no human being who can so totally captivate us that we remain captivated and motivated by his example for life. For every human being turns out to be a fairly disappointing example of humanity eventually. But when we look to Jesus, we look to humanity in all of its perfection. We look at someone who is glorious. We look at someone who we will never tire of looking at if we're looking for beauty and excellence of character. So Jesus alone is a human being that you can look to and hope to finally get over your obsession with yourself. Looking to Jesus is the only real cure to the sort of self-centeredness which ruins our chances of living life well. Last week I mentioned the fact that the real key to being a miserable person is to cultivate self-centeredness. For the person who focuses his attention upon himself will always be disappointed with life and always be miserable. Well, we ought to be concerned about how not to be miserable. And if self-centeredness produces misery, then we ought to be interested in becoming unself-centered. And the only cure for self-centeredness is to find someone so fascinating that you stop thinking of yourself simply by default. You lose interest in yourself because you develop such a strong interest in someone else. Jesus is that person who you can develop such an honest interest in as you consider him and get to know him that you'll quite spontaneously lose interest in your own self. He is that fascinating, that intriguing a person. So for a number of reasons, the endurance of our faith depends upon who you look to as your role model. Verses 2 and 3 and 4 are drawing comparisons between the life that Jesus lived, the life of faith, that is the race that Jesus ran, and the life of faith, or the race that we are to run. And our faith's endurance depends upon us continuing to look upon him. Well, now that's the truth. And it's not the only place in the Bible that tells it to us, but here in Hebrews chapter 12 we're told again we must be focusing our attention upon Jesus. The challenge here for each of us is to figure out how you're going to do that. How is that actually going to take place on a holiday Monday or a Tuesday back to work after a long weekend, it being a short week and all? We've got all of these factors in our minds, all of these ways in which we interpret life. And through all of that, we must become people who are really focused upon Jesus. And who remember to stay focused on him while going through all the mundane realities of everyday life and going through all of the spectacular irregularities of life. And I don't know any way to keep a focus on Jesus other than to continue to be learning about him, continue to get to know him. Because our mind dwells on things that are new. And if what you know about Jesus is what you've known about Jesus for the last 10 years, then you're not going to be able to maintain your focus upon him because it's old stuff, even if it is good stuff. We must be continuing to learn. And we learn about Jesus in a couple of ways: by studying his word and by living life in obedience to him. For he has promised to reveal himself to the one who has his commandments and keeps them. And so if we are exploring new dimensions of obedience, Jesus will disclose himself to us. And if we're studying His Word, looking always to the Bible as the revelation of Jesus Christ to His people, we will be learning new things about Him. And so continuing to focus our attention upon Him. And so choosing Him as a role model will increase the hope of our faith's endurance. And that's the first thing that comes out of Hebrews chapter 12. When we get to verse 5 and go on to verse 11, we see yet another factor upon which our faith's endurance depends. We can say it this way: how well your faith endures depends upon how you look at your difficulties. How you look at your difficulties. And I'm thinking particularly of what it says in verse 7 when it says it is for discipline that you endure. The word translated discipline is repeated or spoken of 9 times in the 7 verses we're looking at right now. 9 times in 7 verses the word discipline is used. If you've got the King James Bible open in front of you, it's the word chastening. This is obviously the theme of these verses. And what we're being told over and over and over again is that the hardships that our faith confronts, the difficulties to our faith, are the Lord's discipline. And if we will look at our difficulties as the Lord's discipline, then we increase the hope of our faith enduring. But if we look at our difficulties in any other way, it will actually erode our faith. So if our faith is to endure, we must look at our difficulties as the Lord's discipline in our lives. Now, the word translated discipline, or chastening in the King James Bible, is in every case a Greek word which is based on a little root word, which is the word in Greek for child. The discipline that the writer is thinking of is the discipline of a parent to a child. That's obvious from verses 5 and 6, where it talks about the Lord scourging His sons or disciplining His sons. And from the verses that follow that talk about God dealing with us as a father deals with His children. The discipline which we are to the discipline that we are to see our difficulties as being is the discipline of a father or a parent raising or training his child. And I suppose there's lots of different philosophies of child raising which would give a different slant to these verses. But I understand that the biblical notion of child raising has everything to do with training your child to obey. Training in obedience is the essence of raising children. And there's lots of factors, of course, involved in that, but if you had to put child raising into a very short summary definition, I would define child raising this way: training your child to obey. And if that's the case, if you bear with me on this, then let's say that a key to our faith's endurance is understanding that all of our difficulties have this in common: all of our difficulties have come into our lives because God is training us to obey Him. God as a father is wanting what a good father always wants for his children, and that is for them to learn to follow a parent's instruction, because only by learning to obey a parent does a child learn to walk in self-control, does a child learn to eventually obey his Heavenly Father, does a child learn responsibility and self-discipline and all the things that go towards maturity. So what we're being told is that whatever happens on your holiday Monday, or the Tuesday back to work after a long weekend, or any of the times in the future, and any of the times in the past, what you're supposed to say about all those difficulties, all of those challenges to faith, is this has come into my life because God is my Heavenly Father and is training me up to be His son or His daughter. All of this is God's discipline. Now that implies a couple of things and doesn't imply a couple of things that we've got to bear in mind. So let me expand upon this idea, lest misunderstandings be created and I be held responsible for them. Let me first of all say that it is true that if you are going to interpret your hardships as the Lord's discipline, then you must believe that God is in control of all things at all times. You must take a very high view of God's sovereign control over all things and believe that God is in control of the world. All I'm really saying is that you must take the Bible seriously. For the Bible from cover to cover continues to assure us that whether we're experiencing prosperity or adversity, it all comes one way or the other from the Lord, who remains in sovereign control of all things. Now I know that some people find that idea utterly repulsive, but I can only understand that to mean that some people find the Bible, in part, utterly repulsive. Because it's not my notion and it's not any other human being's notion. It flies in the face of what seems to be evidence to the contrary. But the Bible clearly says over and over again, look at the lives of the characters that the Bible chooses to profile. Look at the life of Christ. Look at the principles that are set down in books like the Proverbs. And over again, we're told over and over again that we must understand that God is in control of all things. Proverbs 16, verse 4, for example, says that God has made everything for a purpose, even the wicked man for the day of evil. God has made everything for a purpose, even the wicked man for the day of evil. So if we are going to believe that the hardships that come into our lives, even the hardships that come in because wicked people have got a hold of us and done some wicked things, we must be believing that God is in control of all things. A thought that some people will simply not tolerate, but in refusing to tolerate it, are refusing to take the Bible seriously when it disagrees with their outlook or their experience. We are saying that God is in control of all things. If God is not in control of all things, then we have to soft pedal the whole notion that our hardships are the Lord's discipline. We'll find ourselves saying things like, well, it's true that bad things happen, but we mustn't think that God is in it. Oh, it's true that God allows it, but God doesn't really intend it, for God's not that sort of God. What we need to think then is what sort of God we think he is. If a terrible thing happens to a human being we know, and we say, well, now don't think that's God, then we're saying that God is distant from his creation, and while he's fully aware of what is going on and could have stopped what's going on, chooses not to stop what's going on. And why? Well, we would say, taking some stock from this verse, well, God means it for our good. And then you've got a Father in heaven who doesn't take very much care of what happens to us, but lets who knows what happen to us because he figures one way or the other it might be good for us. Now, if my neighbor was that kind of father to his children and let all kinds of things happen, not particularly wanting them to happen, but philosophizing that these things happening will probably do his child some good, I would lose a lot of respect for that parent. I would say that parent ought to keep his little child under much firmer control and see to it that only things that really will work out for good happen to that child. And if the father next door continues to demonstrate no particular control over his little child, letting all sorts of unthinkable things happen because they just happen to happen, well, we would wonder about the parenting. And we would wonder about God's parenting of us if what we must say about difficulties in our lives is just that God figured one way or the other was going to do us good. Anybody can say that. Anybody can guess that something good comes out of everything. But this is not what we're being told. We're being told that God has set a race for us, that God disciplines those whom he loves, that God reproves and disciplines and even scourges the son whom he loves. The hardships are like the scourging of a father. Now, does a father scourge or spank his child in some sort of random way? Just heap some sort of physical abuse upon the child, figuring it'll do him good? No, the father who believes he must spank his child spanks his child utterly carefully. He makes sure that the punishment he measures out is exactly appropriate to the condition and will do the child no harm, but only good. And of course, every human parent is subject to error. Our text says that. Our parents do what they think is best, but they're only human. They make mistakes. We expect better. That is more definite control, more definite care on the part of God the Father, who is an excellent, a perfect Father. And so we interpret our hardships boldly as the discipline, the child raising of our God and Father. And we are implying God's total control when we do so. On the other hand, we are not implying, let it be said and understood, we are not implying, therefore, that every time any Christian goes through any kind of difficulty, God is punishing him for his sin. That's a logical step that a lot of people take. They say, well, okay, there it is. God deals with us as with sons. It is for discipline that you endure. That means, think of all my friends who've gone through hard times. Hoo-hoo, boy, they've been in some sort of sin. Spank, spank, spank. And we mustn't think that. Because the word discipline is a much broader word than the word punishment. And punishing for bad behavior is certainly a part of discipline. You're not disciplining your child if you never punish bad behavior. But there's far more to disciplining your child. That is, there's far more to training your child in obedience than simply spanking for bad behavior or punishing for bad behavior. There's also the whole notion of raising your child up in terms of developing his or her potential. So that sometimes when a Christian goes through a hard time, it is true that God is bringing that hard time into his experience as a punishment, as a scourging, it says boldly in verse 6. But it's not always the case. It might be that a Christian goes through hard times because he must be punished for his carelessness or his deliberate disobedience. But at other times, you go through hardships because of your obedience, because you have learned so much and developed so well as a child of God that you actually graduate into more rigorous training. So the child who successfully completes all of his elementary courses graduates to high school, where the homework is harder and the lessons are tougher and the disciplines are more rigorous. And you don't say, though some children might say, well, now you're in grade 9, you must have really been bad. No, now you're in grade 9 because you've completed all of elementary school. You are now on to the tough stuff. So we would say to some Christians going through hard times, you must be some special, high potential kind of child of God, that he would take you through such a difficult place. He must have great ideals for you. He must have an amazing future for you. It's not always punishment. It's always discipline. We're being told that. It is for discipline that you have things to endure, but it's not always punishment. Sometimes it's the consequences of obedience, not the consequences of disobedience, that brings a person through hardship. So it's utterly careless and irresponsible and reckless to sidle up to some poor suffering Christian and say, I want to help you. Let's you and me sit down and discuss your sin. I'd like to help you figure out why God is punishing you. Now, we go to the opposite extreme if we rule out the possibility that that may be true. But we mustn't be certain that it's true, for it's just as likely, and in some people's lives it would seem more likely, that it's because of some past obedience that the person is going through hardship, not because of some past disobedience. We are saying that God is in control of circumstances, but we're not saying that every hardship is proof of sin being punished. The other thing that must be said about this notion of hardships and difficulties as discipline is that if we see it rightly, if we think biblically about our circumstances, we ought, in fact, to draw great joy, not great sorrow, from our hardships. Verse 11 tells us this is going to be tough to do. It says, all discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. You're being told in advance, this is going to take a stretch of imagination to see your difficulties as a source of joy. Because, of course, what we focus on during the difficulties is the here and now. And for the present, all discipline, without exception, seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet if we look ahead, if we think of the finish line, we remember that to those who have been trained by it, afterwards, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. And because we can trust God in our hardships to be disciplining us so that afterwards our lives will yield the peaceful fruit of righteousness, then our hardships themselves become sources of joy. We can assure ourselves that this is all going to work out marvelously. That God is confident that he is going to be able to convince us when all is said and done that the path he took us down is exactly the path we would have chosen to go down if only we knew everything. But of course we don't. So we look at the way our lives are going, and we can think of a dozen ways we would prefer our lives to go. If only this hadn't happened, if only this wasn't happening, and only that wasn't true. And we can think of the things we've done to bring upon us our own difficulties. And we can think of the things that other people have done to us that have brought upon us our difficulties. And we can think of 24 ways and 36 ways we'd prefer to be living than the way we are living. But God is telling us, if only we knew everything all at the same time, we would be choosing to go down the very path he's got us going down. Because we are going to love how this story ends up. We're going to love how it works out. This is his assurance to us. And what we're told overall on this point is that what the discipline of the Lord proves is that we really are sons and daughters of God. For he wouldn't be taking us through these things if he didn't love us so much. Now that flies in the face of the evidence, but that's what we're being told. God would not be bothering with us like this if he did not have such high and lofty plans for us. But he loves us way too much to let us blunder around in meaningless valleys. He means to move us on to higher ground. He means to make us people who yield the peaceful fruit of righteousness and share in his holiness, it says in verse 10. He means to make us like Christ because he has adopted us to be the brothers and sisters of Christ. It's proof of his sonship. If we needed to see that somewhere else, we'll never lack for evidence, for the Bible is full of references to this very fact, that the hardships we go through only serve to reinforce God's acceptance of us and his adoption of us. For example, when the Apostle Paul was writing to the Thessalonians, who were a beat-up bunch of Christians, going through some really difficult times, he said, "We ourselves speak proudly of you among the churches of God for your perseverance and faith in the midst of all your persecutions and afflictions which you endure. For they are a plain indication of God's righteous judgment so that you may be considered worthy of the kingdom of God for which indeed you're suffering." Now this is in regard to those sufferings which came upon them directly for their faith, directly because of their obedience. But it is the same point, that these difficulties you endure make the apostle proud because they serve as a plain indication that God has accepted you and considered you worthy of the kingdom of God. So we become these peculiar people. The more and more biblical we are, we become these peculiar people who actually welcome into our lives the hardships. James says that we count it all joy when we fall into various trials and difficulties because we know what these trials mean and we know what these trials accomplish. And I would challenge you by the authority of God's word to try it on for size. And in regard to the irritation in your life which is most painful or the challenge which is most difficult, take it as joy. Thank God that you're in it. Thank God for what he's going to accomplish through it. Thank God that he didn't prevent it from happening, that he didn't put you into some other channel of life where the going was easier. Because he loves you so much, he wants for you what could only be accomplished this way. And see how that changes your outlook. It'll not only change your outlook, but it'll change your faith. It'll make your faith more enduring. For how well your faith endures depends upon how you look at your difficulties. God tells us to look at them as his child raising, as his discipline. And then we go to verses 12 and 13, which is the real application of the verse, of the section. And it talks about strengthening the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, making straight paths for our feet so that the limb which is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. And what that tells us is that how well your faith endures depends upon how you look after your weaknesses, how you look after your weaknesses. For the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble is a reference to the fact that when it comes to running the race that's set before us, we've all got some physical limitations that make it difficult to run well. And if you didn't at the starting line, you certainly will halfway through the course, when the wear and tear of the run, of the race, begins to wear you down. We've all got aspects of our life that make it difficult to continue enduring in the faith. Now we've got a choice of how to look after those weaknesses. And if we take one choice, we will seriously limit our faith. But if we take the other choice, we will endure in our faith. The natural thing to do with those aspects of life that weaken faith is the natural thing to do with a physical limitation. If one of your legs is beginning to get really sore, what you naturally do is what we call favoring it, which means that you walk funny so that you don't have to put much weight on it. If your arm is sore, you favor it by giving all the work to the other arm, even if it is your right arm, which does things more naturally well, or your left arm, depending on which orientation you are. Favoring it means not using it anymore so that you don't notice how limited you are by it. But you know what happens if you favor a particular weakness in your body. If all you ever do is stop using it, if that's the sum and substance of your strategy for looking after that weakness, you will gradually lose all use of that limb. If you refuse to put any weight on your leg because your leg is sore, eventually you have no leg there at all. It will just die and rot and fall off. If you refuse to use a particular muscle because it's strained, that muscle will never get back its full use. And on a spiritual level, listen, on a spiritual level, there are people doing that all the time. In regard to some particular part of the Christian life, they find it very difficult in some particular area to get on, trusting and obeying God. So they favor that aspect of life. Perhaps it's the whole issue of submitting to human authority. They're under certain human authorities that they can't stomach the idea of submitting to. So they favor that area. That is, they work themselves out of those circumstances where it's particularly important to be in submission to authority. And by refusing to exercise that particular aspect of life, they eventually lose all use of it. And you know, it's really a scary thought that in this day and age, in this part of the world, there are so many different churches, so many different denominations, so many different ways of doing church, that it's possible, in fact, I think it's quite probable, that whole congregations form up. Whole congregations are created with people, comprised of people who are committed to not using a particular limb or a particular aspect of life because they don't like it and it hurts when they do. So then you get a church that has a church-wide weakness in regard to some particular part of life because everybody touring around the churches and trying to find where they'll be comfortable, everybody with a certain weakness gravitates towards that church where that weakness isn't noticed. And so you have churches that leave untouched whole areas of the Christian life because they've all agreed together to favor themselves in that particular part of life. That's a scary thought as we think of our own church. And the fact that many people come to a church, find themselves no longer comfortable, and they move on for a multitude of reasons, but other people settle in and say, yeah, this is where I'm going to do church. And it's got to be, I mean, it just goes without saying that all the people who settle into this church are people who want to do church in similar ways. So we pool our strengths and no doubt pool our weaknesses. And perhaps stop feeling bad about our weaknesses because we all share them. And we say, well, you know, all the people I like are also neglecting that aspect of life, and they don't seem to be minding, so I don't mind, so no one minds. And we grow weaker and weaker until we lose the whole use of some particular part of life. Some people are very, very uncomfortable in praying with other Christians. So they just avoid places where Christians pray together. And they spend their whole Christian life never learning to pray. And so never gaining the strength that comes from praying together. And it doesn't bother them because they just stay away from the places where they would be made to feel uncomfortable about that. Well, favoring the weakness is a very deadly way of looking after our weaknesses. And so we have to find another way. And what the text is telling us is the other way. When it says, strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, and make straight paths for your feet so that the limb which is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. What it's telling us is not to favor the weakness, but to straighten it out, or to strengthen it. Actually, both cases, it's the word straighten, literally. Therefore, straighten the hands that are weak, and straighten the knees that are feeble, and make straight paths for your feet, which is talking about intensive therapy, which is talking about rehabilitative exercises, so that the areas of weakness become areas of strength. If we will look after our weaknesses by seeing to it that with the help that God provides through various means, those weaknesses are strengthened, then we will endure in our faith. But if we continue to ignore those areas of weakness because, after all, they cause pain and embarrassment, we will grow weaker and weaker in our faith, and our faith will not endure. And I remind you that if God has filled our lives with blessings and hardships, all intended to raise us up as children, it's because he loves us so much that he will not let us go. Which means that to ignore the weaknesses is only to prolong the agony. God loves us too much to let us stay undeveloped in certain areas of life. He would be a neglectful father if he said, well, it doesn't matter to him, so why should it matter to me? Let's just ignore that part of life. God forbid that God should say that to us about the areas of life that slow us down. Now, the only way to get over the difficulties and the embarrassment is to address the weaknesses. Take them to God. Ask them as your Father. Ask him as your Father for advice and help and strength to overcome those weaknesses like you want your children to do to you, so that together you and God can work to make strong those aspects of life which are weak. And your faith will endure. And you will run the race that is set before you. And one day the race will be over. And you'll look up into the eyes of Jesus. And if you haven't been glad before, you'll be glad then that your faith endured, that you continue trusting and obeying oh my, will you be glad. Oh, will you be so glad that you didn't give up, that you kept running the race, that you crossed the line and ran into the arms of the one who has authored your faith and promises to finish your faith until you get there. May God help us to see life that way and run accordingly.